So just want to point out to y'all, Dr. Smith is observing today. He's not observing you, he's observing me. So just, continue as you are. Which will be fine because I know you all are great. So before we get started, just want to remind everybody, vocab quiz 11 is due by midnight on Sunday. And remember too, I'm only grading the 10 best quizzes, or only the 10 best grades will count. So at this point, you're just getting yourself extra points. But those vocab terms may still appear on the exam, right? So make sure that you are still keeping up with these. I will give everybody a set of sample essay exam questions next week to help you all prepare. All right. You're also going to be reading Virginia Woolf for next time. You're going to be reading the excerpts from A Room of One's Own and the short essay Professions for Women. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about upcoming assignments? Okay, great. So y'all should be at least getting your sources together for the annotated bibliography at this point. Remember that the point of this is to get you to do your research before you come up with a thesis or start writing the paper. So what I've got here is, and I will give you copies of these things as well. What I've got here is an annotated bibliography that is built out of an article that I've published on the radio plays of the Northern Irish poet William McNeice, whom you've never heard of and probably won't hear of unless you take Irish Lit or Modern Lit with me later on. But yeah, so if you look over these paragraphs, right, you'll get a good sense of what kinds of information I want from you in the annotated bibliography, right? You give me a short rundown of the argument. You tell me a little bit about the credentials of the author and why we should listen to this person. And tell me a little bit about what good the article is going to do you, right? How you plan to use it. Okay, so any questions about the annotated bibliography or about the paper?
How are you going to grade the bibliography?
If you give me 5 good sources with a full paragraph annotation, you get full credit. So basically, it's going to be based, so I think it's 5 points out of the 20 for the paper total, right? And as long as I get as long as I get the completed annotated bibliography from you, you get full credit for it.
And that's due Friday.
Not this Friday, but next Friday.
Oh, what time is this Friday?
It's the 22nd.
I thought it was 15th.
Is it? Well, I'll give you till the 22nd. All right. Any other questions about the annotated bibliography of the paper? Okay. I imagine you do have questions about this poem. Okay. So, and just level with me here. Just be honest here. How well do you feel like you understood this? Not at all.
Minimal.
You felt like you okay.
Yeah.
You felt the same way, Savannah?
Little understanding.
Okay.
But I would totally fail a quiz if you gave me this. I agree.
All right. So you see why I gave you all this week's quiz on Monday and not today, right? Yeah. I to give you a quiz on this would have been cool. So you feel like you got a little bit of it, Savannah. What did you feel like you were getting? What did you feel like you did understand?
I got in the burial of the dead. It was the reference to a burial service for Angelicans. I feel like I got how that section was talking about it.
Okay.
In the basic sense, but I couldn't give you full details on it.
Okay.
I feel like every section, if you looked into what the title was referencing, I understood how he was referencing it.
Okay.
Don't ask questions though.
Okay, it might actually maybe that would be a good place to start here is with these headings that he gives each section, right? Because there is something very particular he's doing with the headings. So the first section is the burial of the dead. second is a game at chess. The third is the fire sermon. The fourth, death by water. And the fifth, what the thunder said. So of the first four sections, each is tied to one of the classical elements. So burial of the dead, that would be, if we're thinking this in terms of the classical elements, earth, air, fire, water, right? What would the burial of the dead probably connect to? Clearly earth, right? Okay, yes, good. And where else can we see obvious connections to the classical elements?
Fire.
Yeah, the fire sermon and death by water, right? It's right in there, yeah? Yeah, okay, good. And a game at chess is connected to air. Relatively loosely. But each of these titles is also a quotation from, or a kind of drawing on, some other text, right? So the burial of the dead is the name of the Anglican funeral service, the heading above the Anglican funeral service, and like if you go to an Anglican church and you open up the, it's not the hymnal, it's the other thing that's next to the hymnal that has all the other stuff in it. I'm not very churchy, so I'm having a hard time remembering what that book is called. But so like the one that has all the different rituals in it, like the ritual for baptism and the ritual for marriage and funerals and all that sort of thing, right? So yeah, the burial of the dead is the name of the Anglican funeral service. A game of chess comes from the title of a play by the Elizabethan playwright Thomas Middleton, who's a contemporary of Shakespeare's. And it involved, the play is about kind of seduction triangle and clever trickery regarding sexual relationships. The fire sermon is a famous sermon by the Buddha in which fire represents the flames of lust, burning you and damaging your soul. Death by water doesn't actually have another text that it references. Death by water, you probably noticed, is the shortest section, but it's also one of the most important, and we're going to spend a good bit of time on it. And what the thunder said is taken from a Hindu philosophical text called the Upanishads. We may or may not get into a deeper discussion of what the Upanishads are concerned with. It kind of just depends on how things go. But what I wanted to do here is show you how the basic design of the poem works, right? So how might the fact that just about all of these titles are taken from other sources, how might that reflect the way the poem is put together? What else did you notice about the content of the poem that might be related to this?
In the game of chess, he referenced a lot of Shakespeare.
Okay, he references a lot of Shakespeare in the game of chess, right? And is this the only place where he references other texts? Give me a couple other examples.
Well, in the burial of the dead, I can't say it. It's whatever that language is, but that was in reference to some other text or some like religion something.
Okay, yeah, there's some quotations from the Bible in here, right? From the book of Ezekiel, from the book of Isaiah. Are you thinking like on page 661, the Frisch Weg der Wind, der Heimat zu, mein Irish Kind, wo weiles du?
Yeah.
Oh yeah, it's German. And it's a quotation from Richard Wagner's opera Tristan and Isolde. Okay, so I think we're starting to get a little bit of the idea here, right? So what is Eliot doing to put this poem together? How much overall of the poem is original to Eliot, and how much of it is borrowed from other sources?
I'd say most of it's borrowed.
Yeah, he's taking these snippets from everywhere, right? And blending them into something different. Right? It's almost kind of like, do y'all know what sampling is in music? Okay, yeah, so when somebody's sampling, what are they doing?
They're like taking someone's track and trying to make it their own, but it's not really their own.
Well, depends, right? There have been cases where they didn't do enough to change the original backing track, right? And then the artist gets sued. Like I remember, you guys are probably too young to remember Vanilla Ice. Okay, y'all know Vanilla Ice. Okay, great. Yeah, I mean he's just rapping over an old Queen song called Under Pressure, and then when Brian May, the songwriter, sued him, he had the gall to say, no, mine's different because theirs is dum 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 da da dum dum, and mine is dum 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 da da dum dum. But good sampling typically does kind of it blends elements from different songs into something new, right? So I want you all to try a little something here, which I think will help us get a sense of what Eliot is doing here. So I've got on this sheet, it's on both sides, I've got a bunch of quotes from high culture, from pop culture, from a variety of different sources. And I want you all to just take a few minutes, like see if you can pick out some particular theme in all of these that you can work into a short poem of your own, right? So a couple of caveats. One, you don't have to use all of them, but try to use at least 3. 2, you can also write some lines of your own to connect these bits together, right? But I want you to try to make it mostly out of the quotations. So take a little time and see what you can come up with here. And remember that with the quotes I give you too, right, you can just take little snippets out of them, right? Just take what's useful. How are we doing here? Okay. Oh, cool.
Talks about puzzling name leading.
All right.
Because chaos was its name. And then in your running to catch up, racing around behind you to catch up to the other three.
Okay.
It's kind of like off of those three.
I think you can maybe continue to maybe like the play on the name, really, get the guess my name part of that. For all things cool as well. Okay, cool. Yeah. I think go with it. See what you can do.
And create something?
What's that?
Did you say create? Like,
Yeah.
I should create something.
Yeah. How you doing, Sam?
Oh, great.
You sound so confident.
Yeah, this is not my one word.
Okay, remember that it's not graded, right? This is low stakes.
There's a lot of nature.
Okay.
Talks about hell and death and eternal.
Okay.
That's what I'm getting at.
Okay. All right. So yes, you can build around that feeling, right? Like ground, like as a punishment. Or,
So would I take these words and add it in and like create something with the words?
Yes.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. Yep.
I'm angry at the moment.
Okay.
Well, I just had to answer another, it'll be in your email. I just write another ad hoc committee message because of Gary.
Oh, okay, yeah. It looks like y'all are starting to write. So once you feel like you have something, just raise your hand and we'll share. Or you will share. Yeah. Are you ready to share?
Sure.
All right.
Be happy to.
All right.
Never please, and this was supposed to be a poem, right?
Yes.
Okay. Never pleased to meet you, never hope of teasing out a smile, never my family, never this life off from me, the red plague rid you, hell is just a frame of mind, never before the sky that covers everything, never be a buffoon for the patronage of some great man.
All right. I actually can see how that grew out of the situation here.
Yeah.
Okay.
He knows what I'm angry about.
Yes. When you graduate, you'll get to go to meetings and do committee work. Just do the best you can. It doesn't have to be, right? Doesn't have to be genius. And actually, like from what I see, it actually does look pretty good.
So I added things to the words that I
Yeah.
wrote out.
Okay, cool. All right.
It's kind of difficult.
What's that?
It's kind of difficult.
Yeah, it is, right? You think that, oh, if I'm already given the materials here, right? I can just mix these words around and it's going to be easy, right? But it's actually really difficult to do well.
Especially if you don't have like a punk band behind you and you don't have a microphone to scream it into.
Yeah, if only you had backing musicians. Yeah.
Yes. Is the design supposed to be strung together a bit more? Because I obviously didn't read the example for the reading for today. Is it supposed to be strung more together with your own words in this style of thing, or is it just sort of one lifted thing after another?
It's lifted material with a lot of kind of connecting material with his own, right?
Yeah.
And yeah, he's changing the meaning as well of much of
Right.
what he is working with. Yeah, Jordan. All right, go for it.
Pleased to meet you. I hope you guess my name. For all in all, it is a game. A puzzle you must solve. For what is the name of the game? And you run to catch up to my player, shorter of breath and one day closer to death.
All right.
Awesome.
Very good. Thank you. Yeah.
See, actual creative people as opposed to this is social scientist.
I'll give you a spreadsheet next time.
I mean, I've got 4 lines I can go.
Okay, yeah.
Okay.
Give us what you got.
Hell is just the nature of the game, what made us be. Chaos was its name, cut this life off from me.
Okay. Yeah, and I mean, that's actually, those 4 lines actually pulled out of their original context work really well together, right? So what you've all done here is made a collage. Do y'all know what a collage is? Did you ever have to make them in art class when you were kids? Okay, so when you were in art class making a collage, what did you have to do? What was the assignment?
Usually like, go ahead, Jordan.
You have to take pictures from different sources or like from magazines and put
Yeah.
them together.
You cut the pictures out, right, or the part you want, and you make it into something new, right? And the new thing references but doesn't necessarily resemble the original, right? And that is the basic technique that Eliot is using in poetry, right? He's making a collage here. And collage is a really, collage is having a moment in early 20th century Europe for a variety of reasons. So we finished up last time, kind of talking a little bit about how World War I impacted poetry, right, in the war years. But what we didn't talk much about was the aftermath. We just didn't have time. So Eliot is writing in Britain in the years after the First World War. And I think it's important for us to think about like what things looked like in Europe and in Britain in particular at that time, right? So in the First World War, 20 million soldiers killed or wounded. Now this is, amongst like all the nations combating, right? This is not just specific to Britain. Britain itself experienced about 1 million casualties. But this was still about a generation of young men, right? A lot of those who came back came back physically maimed or psychologically damaged. So, I don't know, Savannah, when you were doing your research for the presentation, you might have run across the word shell shock. Okay, do you remember what shell shock was?
It was something like where their faces were like constantly grief-stricken, like they couldn't, it's like they couldn't process anything else because they were still stuck in that, like the war.
Yeah, it's kind of it's what we would now call post-traumatic stress disorder, right? It's what's that?
PT. They actually have changed the name.
Oh, they have.
From disorder to syndrome because it's supposed to be anyway.
Okay, that I did not know.
Apparent.
Okay.
I'm not an expert.
So yeah, this is the original name for post-traumatic stress syndrome, and it was very poorly understood as well. The general idea was if you were suffering from shell shock, it wasn't because you had been through this traumatic thing that your brain wasn't biologically capable of processing. Rather, it was because of a failing of nerve or of courage on your part, right? And so if you were suffering from shell shock, okay, fine. You get to spend a couple weeks in the hospital and they're going to put you right back out on the front. So a lot of young men were coming back home with these really untreated psychological disorders, right? This unprocessed trauma. We read Wilfred Owen for last time. Owen spent several days trapped with the remains of a fellow officer, like what was left of his comrade. Just like basically like alone, but for not even a corpse, but pieces of a corpse, right? And Owen's experience was not atypical. So this kind of thing was happening a lot. You also had about 8 million civilians killed. And huge geopolitical changes as well. The war basically spelled the end for the Austro-Hungarian and Ottoman empires. So you had all of these smaller little nations popping up, particularly in southeastern Europe, as these old empires fell apart. And you had, during the war, a communist revolution in Russia. Which toppled the old feudal order there. And beginning in 1918, this is something that should ring familiar bells here, right? There was a worldwide flu pandemic. Right? People just couldn't catch a break here. So the mood of much of Europe in the 1920s is a pretty dark one, right? It kind of looks like everything's falling to shit, right? Everything's coming unglued, everything's coming apart. Yeah, Jordan.
Sorry, what does that say?
What is what?
Hungarian?
Austro-Hungarian, yes. So there were two major artistic responses to this, or two kind of groups that formed in direct response to the war. The first actually came together before the war, and their style was kind of discredited by it, their ideas were discredited by it. So there was a group called the Futurists, primarily in Italy, who argued that humanity and biology were essentially forms of weakness, right? And that what the world needed was to kind of meld human beings with the speed and efficiency of machines. So futurist art tended to celebrate speed and motion, to to celebrate machinery. It tended to be aggressively pro-war. Several of the futurists argued that war was a kind of great, kind of hygienic practice, right? It was the sort of thing that could cleanse the world, right? By sweeping away all of the old stuff and making room for the new, right? So they're anti-history, generally speaking. Now, the other major European artistic response came from a group that called itself Dada. And Dada was a kind of nonsense word. It's either repetition of the Russian word for yes twice. It's infantile babble for father, right? Part of the point, though, is that it's a word that doesn't really mean anything. And the Dada artists were mostly war exiles, hanging out in places like Zurich, Paris, and New York City, even though very few of them were actually from those places. They tended actually to come from places that had already been ravaged by war, and they were hiding out in places that were relatively insulated. And Dada was primarily about the idea that art is bullshit. Yeah, go ahead, Jordan.
I saw this in, I think, art history.
Okay.
It was, I don't know what they used, but they just used an object and called it art.
Yes, okay, I know exactly what you're thinking of
I
here.
don't remember what it was.
Okay, so one of the major Dadaists in New York was a French exile by the name of Marcel Duchamp.
Mhm.
And Duchamp was on the jury for an art show. And as a joke, he signed a urinal R. Mutt and submitted it as though it was, submitted by some other artist to the show. And everybody else on the jury said, no, this is nonsense. You can't put a urinal in an art show just because somebody signed it. But Duchamp argued that, well, actually, art is just a matter of selection, right? It's art if I say it's art. So I don't see why this urinal is not art if I want it to be, right? So the basic point that a lot of the Dada artists were trying to make is that not only is art basically bullshit, it's also completely subjective. And so much of what Dada art was about were these kind of elaborate pranks or these kind of nonsense performances. Like the poet Hugo Ball would give these performances where he'd stand up in a paper outfit dressed like a pope. And he would spout out these nonsense poems while somebody furiously drummed behind him, right? These kind of, like African-based rhythms. And so he would intersperse his nonsense poems with, the names of animals, ones were like, zebra and rhinoceros, right? So there would be just enough recognizable verbiage in there that you'd look for some kind of meaning in the poem, but then when you try to take it apart, there's nothing there. There's nothing at the core of it, right? And so why do you think people would do this? Why do you think this would be a response to a situation like the First World War? What do you think is going on in these people's heads?
It's their own version of a boycott.
Okay, why would you say a boycott, Jordan?
Because they're just doing ridiculous things to annoy people, to cause anger.
Yeah. I mean, in a lot of ways, it's about making some people laugh and making others annoyed, right? The target usually is the professional, puffed-up bourgeois artist, right? Hence, Hugo Ball wearing the Pope costume and pronouncing his nonsense poems very, very seriously. Think about, maybe it would help if we think again about this context here, right? What's the world look like when this art is coming into being? yeah, if everything, like people are dying around you, like the landscape is torn up, you've got nations at each other's throats, right? And then people dying of flu on top of that. Does the world look like it makes any sense? So, yeah, part of the argument that the Dada artists were making was that when the world itself doesn't make any sense, right, art needs to reflect that. If human experience is basically meaningless, art, which is formed out of human experience, also must be meaningless. And so these are kind of some of the viewpoints that are informing what Eliot is doing. Right? Eliot is, he's an American. He's actually born in St. Louis and educated at Harvard. But he lives pretty much his entire adult life in Britain, at first by accident, because he happened to be in England when the war started and then couldn't get home. And then just, settles there. He gets a job while he's working in a bank at the time he writes The Wasteland. And eventually becomes a very influential editor at Britain's top poetry publisher, Faber & Faber. But we can kind of pull the idea of the wasteland itself out of, I think, some of what's going on with Futurism and with Dada. So what is a wasteland?
It's like desolate, like it can't be fixed, it can't be revived.
Yeah. When we think of a wasteland, we think of desolation, and infertility, right? And this is where the other major strain that is informing what Eliot's doing comes in. So I want to first look for a second at the way he describes the wasteland itself in The Burial of the Dead. If we turn to page 660. Can I get one of you to start reading for me the passage that starts with, "What are the roots that clutch?"
What are the roots that clutch? What branches grow out of this stony rubbish? Son of man, you cannot say or guess, for you know only a heap of broken images where the sun beats, and the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone is no sound of worm, only there is shadow under this red rock. Come in under the shadow of this red rock, and I will show you something different from either. Your shadow at morning striding behind you, or your shadow at evening rising to meet you. I will show you fear and a handful of dust.
Thank you. So the last line of this, I think, is actually key to the poem here. When I first read this poem when I was in high school, I was in basically the same position you are today, right? I had no freaking clue what any of this meant. But I wrote that line all over my notebooks because it just sounded really metal. Right? I will show you fear in a handful of dust, right? You can just like imagine somebody death metal croaking that out. But what do you think that means? I will show you fear in a handful of dust. Why should I be afraid of a handful of dust?
I mean, if you take it in like the sense of infertility, it's like if you have that miscarriage or you can't have a baby at all, and it's like that's fearful. It's something so small.
Yeah.
Like it's terrifying.
And I think the idea of dust suggests infertility, right? Dust is this kind of useless, dry soil that just kind of sifts through your hand, right? It's not rich, dark earth. It's dust. It's lifeless. It's decay. It's not giving rise to anything else. So, like pretty much everyone else his age in this period, Eliot was reading a book by an anthropologist by the name of J.G. Fraser called The Golden Mouth. which is first published in 1890. Have either of you heard of this before? I know that I'm not sure if you've encountered this in other classes or if anybody's talked about this particular book with you. Okay, so total unfamiliarity. Okay, so I can say whatever I want.
It's a book about robots.
Yeah. So many robots. Robots with golden arms, yes. So the Golden Bough was kind of really controversial in its day because of the argument it was making about the origin of religion. For Fraser, all religion originates in fertility ritual. And all myths are essentially narrative versions of fertility rituals, right? So, all of the characters in a myth will have some kind of analog in some kind of fertility rite. And the kind of rite that Fraser typically had in mind was something along the nature of, like you have, a sacrifice in the spring of someone or something that represents the god, right? Or a sacrifice in the autumn of someone or something that represents the god, right? Who then comes back in the spring. And so he looks at all of these kind of life, death, rebirth deities across different cultures. So he talks about the Egyptian Osiris, the Norse Balder, the Mexican, the Mesoamerican Chipetotec, the Greek Dionysus, and in a move that got him into a lot of hot water with his peers, the Christ story as well. He looks at all of these as reflections of these ancient fertility rituals that are really kind of like what daily life in the ancient world was concerned with. So this is one source of Eliot's thinking here, of Eliot's concern here. Although he's thinking about this fertility not just in terms of the physical fertility of the land, but also in terms of the fertility of human beings. And so there's a lot in the poem about sexuality here as well, right? Particularly in the fire sermon section and in the game of chess. So if we go to the fire sermon, I want to look for a moment. Let me just see where we are for time. Okay, we got plenty of time. At page 666, can I get one of you to start reading the passage that starts with "At the violet hour"?
At the violet hour, when the eyes and back turn upward from the desk, when the human engine waits, like a taxi throbbing waiting. Word.
Tiresias.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's pause that. Let's actually pause there for a second. Do y'all know who or what Tiresias is in Greek mythology? I will take your silence to mean no. Okay, so Tiresias is the seer of the city of Thebes. So he is noted in the myths in which he appears for being a blind man who predicts disasters. So that's part of the Tiresias myth that Eliot is referencing here. But the other part of it appears in the Roman poet Ovid's Metamorphoses, which I think if you take World Lit 1 with Dr. Russell, you will probably read at least part of. So, you did the
I took it
Metamorphosis?
last
Okay.
semester.
Yeah, I don't think this is in the excerpt that's in the Norton Anthology, though, so you may not have covered this one. But so in Ovid's Metamorphoses, Tiresias is walking on the mountainside one day. He sees two snakes humping each other. He says, "Hey, stop that," and hits him with a stick. The minute he hits the humping snakes with a stick, he is transformed into a woman. So he spends the next 7 years of his life as a woman. Then he is walking up the mountain again, sees another pair of snakes humping each other, hits him with a stick, and is transformed back into a man. So Tiresias, in addition to being a seer who predicts disasters, also knows what it's like to be both sexes, right? Okay, so now that we have that out of the way, you may proceed, Savannah.
I, Tiresias, the blind throbbing between two lives, old man with wrinkled female breast, can see at the violet hour the evening hour that strives. Homeward and brings the sailor home from sea, the typist home at tea time, clears her breakfast, lights her stove, and lays out fitted tins. Out of the window, perilously spread, her dry combinations touched by the sun's last rays. On the divan or pile, at night her bed, stockings, slippers, camisoles, and stays. I, Tiresias, old man with wrinkled duds, perceived the scene and foretold the rest. I too awaited the expected guest. He, the young man, carbuncular, arrives.
Basically, the young man with pimples. Yeah.
A small house agent's clerk with one bold stare, one of the low on whom a shirt sits as a silk hat on a Bradford millionaire. The time is now propitious as he guesses. The meal is ended, she is bored and tired, endeavors to engage her in caresses, which still are unreproved, if undesired. Flushed and decided, he assaults at once. Exploring hands encounter no defense, his vanity requires no response, and makes a welcome of indifference. And I, Tiresias, have suffered all enacted on the same divan or bed, I who have sat by thieves below the wall, and walked among the lowest of the dead. Bestows one final patronizing kiss, and gropes his way, finding the stairs and lift.
Okay, so thank you. So what happens in this scene that Tiresias describes for us?
It almost seems like he sexually assaulted her. 'Cause he,
Yeah.
he was like, I attacked.
Yeah, and I think one thing that we need to remember about this poem as well is this is kind of written before modern concepts of consent. So there would be nothing legally actionable here if she doesn't specifically say no, right? But yeah, it does seem as though he kind of forces himself on her and she doesn't stop him, right? And the reason why Tiresias is the spokesperson, is the person who sees all of this, is the idea that Tiresias has experienced life as a man and life as a woman, and so knows this from both sides. Let's then look at the response here once the young man has left. Jordan, can you read for us, starting with she turns and looks a moment in the glass?
She turns and looks a moment in the glass, hardly aware of her departed lover. Her brain allows one half-formed thought to pass. Well, now that's done, and I'm glad it's over. When lovely woman stoops to Polly and paces about her room, again, alone. She smooths her hair with automatic hand and puts a record on the gramophone.
We can stop there. Right? So, how much does this encounter seem to have meant to her? What effect does it seem to have had on her?
It seems like nothing. Well, she obviously didn't like it. But then she just goes about her day, plays some music.
Yeah, like she's what's the specific phrase that she smooths her hair with automatic hand, right, and puts a record on the gramophone, right? So so there's something mechanical about the way she behaves here, right? So maybe a little bit of futurist influence in that, like combining human action, human emotions with the emotions of machines. But it's also clear that this is a kind of meaningless sexual encounter that is satisfying no one. and will produce nothing, right? And that's one of the major themes in the poem, right? Eliot's fears, right, that fear in the handful of dust, about the degeneracy or the degeneration of European civilization. And so one of the things he's doing by quoting all of this stuff from other sources, I think there's a line near the end of the poem that I think is actually key to understanding. If you look on page 673, right? These fragments I have shored against my ruin. Yeah, there you go. These fragments I have shored against my ruin. So think about that for a minute in the context of what we've been discussing, right? How would you read that line in light of the poem's technique?
Well, fragments is like representing, like he took fragments of different pieces from different people.
Yeah. So the fragments are the little bits the poem is made out of, right? And what does the line suggest about the purpose he's aiming at by pulling all of these fragments together?
Maybe like to hide the effects of the war on him. It's like short against by ruins, like covered up.
Uh-huh. Yeah, there's something defensive about it, right? I'm pulling all of these elements of European civilization, both high culture and low culture, together, fusing them with a little bit of Indian philosophy in order to stop myself from falling apart, right? So the whole poem is, in a lot of ways, a kind of form of psychological self-defense, right? I'm pulling these things together, I'm blending them together in order to give myself some sort of coherent basis for thinking that culture might be okay on some level. That maybe I can still protect myself. But part of the problem here too is that when he's pulling these things out of their original contexts, as was happening with what you were doing with the collage poems, right? They're taking on new meaning. And this is actually also part of, it's partly by design, at least, right? There's a quote from an essay Eliot wrote around the same time he was working on this poem. So the essay is on the work of a minor Renaissance playwright by the name of Philip Massinger. You haven't heard of him, and you won't hear of him. Even if you take like the specialist class in Renaissance drama, you probably won't cover Philip Massinger. The dude's that obscure, and deservedly so. So that. But what Eliot writes in this essay is that immature poets imitate. Mature poets steal. Bad poets deface what they take. And good poets make it into something better, or at least something different. So let's just take a minute and take this apart here. let's start with this first sentence. Immature poets imitate. Mature poets steal. What do you think is the distinction here that Eliot's drawing? How is imitation different from stealing? And why might stealing be more mature?
Like if you steal, it's almost like you're owning up, like, yeah, I did it. Versus imitate, you're like, no, I did that, it's mine.
Yeah, stealing does imply a transfer of ownership, right? That if I steal this, it's not yours anymore, it's now mine. And I'm going to do whatever I like with it. Right? When you imitate, all you're doing is essentially making a copy, right? I want my thing to be like your thing, not I am going to take your thing and use it for my own purposes. And what the wasteland is in a lot of ways is a very, very large act of exactly this kind of theft, right? He's taking all of these bits and pieces from other writers and other texts that he admires and using them for his own purposes and to make his own arguments. Now, the overarching myth that he's building all of this on is the Grail story. So how many of you are familiar with the Grail myth, or with the idea of the Holy Grail? Is there a little bit? Okay, what do you all know about the Holy Grail? Okay, yeah, it's tied typically into the King Arthur mythology. Yeah.
It's what they search for.
Yes, the knights go searching for it at some point near the end of Arthur's reign, right? And it's really kind of that going off questing for the Holy Grail, right, for the spiritual ideal, in a lot of the tales that causes the Round Table Fellowship to fall apart, right? The knights are going off on the spiritual quest instead of attending to the actual needs of the kingdom, and so everything goes to shit. Anything else y'all know about the Grail story? About characters in it, or locations that are important within it?
Harrison Ford.
Harrison frickin' Ford. This looks like the cup of a carpenter, yeah. Indiana friggin' Jones, yeah. So
It's as legitimate of a Grail myth as anyone else.
it is. I mean, yeah, it is an entirely made-up story, yeah. And we know that it's an entirely made-up story in part because the nature of an imagery of the Grail change from story to story, right? In some stories, it's the cup from which Christ was served at the Last Supper. In some stories, it's the cup that caught his blood while he was on the cross. In some stories, it's both of those things. But in the original Grail story, it's actually a giant silver serving dish. The word Grail is probably taken from a word that was current in southern France and northern Spain in the 12th century, Graal, which simply meant a serving dish. But here's where Eliot is using the Grail story. So there's, in the original Grail story, which was written by a French poet by the name of Chrétien de Troyes, there's a character called the Fisher King. And the Fisher King rules an area called the Wasteland. So he sits in a little boat fishing all day. And the questing knight comes to realize that the reason he sits in a little boat is because his legs are useless. He has been wounded in the thigh. Now, what might we be able to guess that's a euphemism for, given the poem's focus on fertility and infertility? What is the Fisher King's actual injury? Yeah, he's actually been castrated, right? Hence, the wasteland. Right? He rules the wasteland, the infertile kingdom. And so the knight, by asking the right questions about the Grail, and by succeeding in the proper trials, is supposed to heal the Fisher King and then bring fertility back to the wasteland, right? And one of these places of testing, is referred to as the Chapel Perilous. Right, where the knight is supposed to be tested or tempted by a demon to see if he is able to kind of remain pure, right, in mind and body. So, given the rest of the content of the poem, how well does Eliot seem to think his peers are measuring up here? What odds do they have of healing the Fisher King, given how they're doing in the Chapel Perilous right now?
Probably
Not good, yeah, not good. And in fact, he connects a lot of this as well to, like we talked about the burial of the dead in the beginning, right? And the idea, like, what happens when you bury a corpse? Eventually.
It decays, after a long time.
Yeah, it decays. Yeah, eventually there'll be nothing left of it, right? But over the period of time, it decays. And what happens to the chemical components then of that body? They get released into the soil, right? And the soil is fertilized and rejuvenated by the buried bodies within, right? So there's the line in the burial of the dead part, page 662. Stetson, you were with me in the ships at my leg. That corpse you planted last year in your garden, has it begun to sprout? Will it bloom this year? Right? That's kind of like presented as the natural order of things. So burial leads to new growth and renewal. This is the idea that's opposed here is death by water. See, I told you we were going to get back around to that little tiny death by water section of the poem, right? So if we go to section 4, on page 669, can one of you please read this for us, starting with Phlebas the Phoenician?
Phlebas the Phoenician, a fortnight dead, forgot the crying gulls and the deep sea swell, and the prophet and loss. A current under sea picked his bones in whispers. As he rose and fell, he passed the stages of his age and youth, entering the whirlpool. Gentile or Jew, O you who turn the wheel and look to windward, consider Phlebas, who was once handsome and tall as you.
Okay, thank you. So, Phlebas' death here is not the only drowning referenced in the poem. If we go back to the burial of the dead, there's that mention of a huge lake in Germany called the Starnberger See. And did any of y'all read the footnote about the Starnberger See? Always, always, always read the footnotes. Okay, so the Starnberger See is the lake in which Ludwig II of Bavaria drowned under kind of iffy, mysterious circumstances. Have any of you ever heard of Mad Ludwig before? Okay, you've heard that name. It sounds a little familiar. Okay, what do you know about him, if anything?
Nothing. I just know I've heard it before.
Yeah, I remember going with my wife, years ago now, to Colonial Williamsburg on a vacation, and we went to Busch Gardens, where you can find all the rides you love about Europe with none of the annoying culture. And they had a haunted house. It was like Mad Ludwig's Castle. And it's like this, crazy werewolf ghost guy, with a German accent who keeps popping out at you. Ludwig II of Bavaria was not actually mad in that way. The reason they called him Mad Ludwig was he had this mania for building these elaborate fairy tale castles that threatened to bankrupt the treasury of Bavaria just because he spent so much damn money on it. So, when he died under mysterious circumstances, it was rumored that, that there were basically two motivations. One was to get the fucker to stop spending so much money. And two, it was because Ludwig was more or less openly homosexual and thus unlikely to ever produce an heir. So getting him out of the way could put a cousin on the throne who would be more likely to continue the line. And death by water in the poem is typically connected by Eliot to homosexuality. And in a lot of ways, this is a pretty homophobic poem. I'm just going to kind of lay that out here right now. That he connects homosexual activity generally to infertility and to these kinds of uses of sexuality he believes don't go anywhere. Right? We have, Ludwig II connected to Phlebas the Phoenician by this drowning. And Phlebas the Phoenician is also connected to that other tarot card, the One-Eyed Merchants. Which we find represented in the character of Mr. Eugenides, the Smyrna merchant. Right, Smyrna being an ancient Middle Eastern city connecting then to Phoenicia. And Phlebas's bit in Death by Water mentioning forgetting the profit and loss. Mr. Eugenides invites whoever the speaker is at that point for lunch at the Cannon Street Hotel and then a weekend at the Metropole, both of which were known gay hangouts in London. So this whole strand of drowning, death by water is opposed by Eliot to the idea of burial and burial's connection to natural fertility. So one thing that might help you understand what's going on in this poem is to kind of keep this dichotomy between burial and drowning and their meanings within the poem straight. Now, do y'all understand this a little better now? A little bit?
Still the hardest
Yeah.
to understand that we've done for me, at least, even after you've explained this.
Yeah, it's not an easy poem. I mean, it's not easy to decipher, and the ideas are not comfortable to sit with either, right? It's a really bleak, pretty negative poem. And a lot of the kind of, even like kind of the cultural concepts embedded in it are things that we've largely moved on from, or like to think we've moved on from. So why do you think I had you read this? If it's such a ridiculous downer and so hard to understand.
Maybe because it ties into the World War I poems that we read last time.
Okay, yeah, it does follow on pretty well from the comparatively simple poems of Owen and Rosenberg and Siegfried Sassoon, right? But it's painting that kind of post-war world rather, it's kind of emptied of meaning rather than that during the War world. Yeah. The other reason I wanted to read this, and this is actually kind of a simpler answer, is just that this is actually probably the most influential poem of the early 20th century. And almost every poem written after is colored in some sense by this. What Eliot is doing in this particular moment is actually pretty new and pretty inventive, and it does inspire a lot of people. Inspiration is kind of it seems like kind of a weird word to use with a poem like this, but there you go. So next time we're going to be looking at a couple of essays by Virginia Woolf. We're going to be looking at some excerpts from A Room of One's Own and a short essay called Professions for Women, where our old friend from Victorian gender discourse, the angel in the house, is going to make another appearance. So we can all look forward to that.